Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about the Bronze Age in Somerset. It has been organised by members of the Archaeology Committee of the Somerset Archaeology and Natural History Society. My name is David Baker, and I'm the chairman of that committee, and that's why I'm introducing this morning's event, which is advertised as Bronze Age Day Part 1. There will be a Part 2, again a Zoom event, on the 20th of November this year with more presentations. Now, unfortunately, this morning, we have only one speaker, Martyn Barber, because Jodie Lewis has had to pull out because of ill health. She has promised to make her presentation in Part 2. So that's all the more reason for people to book Part 2. Now, I'm sure we all look forward to Martyn's talk, which will be recorded and made available later on YouTube. At this point, I will hand over to David Dawson, who is our secretary, who will introduce Martyn and tell you all about how to ask questions and other things. So over to you, David.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you join us this morning. And I would like to thank Martyn in advance for offering to contribute. Martyn is here to put the bronze back into the Bronze Age, I think, with particular relevance to Somerset. We anticipate that you will have many questions arising from Martyn's presentation. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a button there called Q&A. If you would like to type into that your name and your question, we will deal with them. I will read them out for Martyn to answer at the end of Martyn's presentation. But please do make use of that button. It will actually hopefully trigger a discussion about what Martyn has to say to us. Now, I'm sure many of you may have read Martyn's excellent book that was published 18 years ago now on bronze and the Bronze Age. I think in that he said that that the definition of the Bronze Age was moving incredibly rapidly. There it is, yes. Highly recommended. In that he actually says that the definition of the Bronze Age is moving so rapidly, what with new discoveries, but also a lot of new perceptions about what we mean by the Bronze Age. This morning, he has turned his attention specifically to Somerset and the way in which the perception of the Bronze Age has changed over the years, and I'm sure will bring us up to date with current thought. So please welcome Martyn with virtual applause. So over to you, Martyn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I'll just try the share screen. Let's see what happens. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Good, right. I should just quickly explain the setup here. Obviously, this is a very different scenario to being in a lecture theatre, because I'm actually sat at my kitchen table. The idea of being sat by myself, talking to myself in the kitchen is something that, I assumed would start happening when I was a little bit older. But, we've reached that point already. I do actually have two laptops here, one with the presentation on and one with my notes on. So if I'm not avoiding eye contact, you see me looking away, I'm checking the notes. The other thing people need to be aware of is that there is a cat in this house who's very disappointed with the state of the weather outside. He has a tendency to sit behind the laptop, but hopefully he'll keep his protests and complaints to himself. Other than that, off we go. I've noticed a few familiar names in the participants as well. So I'm prepared for the kind of questions that they might ask, as opposed to the questions that the rest of the audience might be offering. Let's see. So Jodie's not here. I just wanted to quickly mention, I don't know if people are aware of the threat to the archaeology department at Worcester University, where Jodie is based, but there is a petition online which more than 10,000 people have already signed. So there's a lot of support to the department. So do search for that. Do make your feelings known about that as well. That's at change.org. I think if you just do a Google search for change.org and Worcester Archaeology, you should get there. Right, moving to the subject of the talk. Yes, David just mentioned the book, Bronze and the Bronze Age, which was published 18 years ago, was actually written 20 years ago. And we had a sort of quick chat about this the other day and the sort of catching up process, what has happened since. I mean, I would hate to have the job of revising that book now, because so much has happened over the last 20 years or so. And in fact, I'm not really going to talk very much at all about what has happened in the last 20 years. In many ways, the book was written just in time before things started getting too complicated. There were a number of things that were just beginning to get underway at the time, new developments, new discoveries, etc. One, of course, was the Portable Antiquities Scheme. The new Treasure Act was just a few years old. The Portable Antiquities Scheme was just underway, and obviously that's had a huge impact on the number of finds that have been reported, not just from Somerset, but from the whole country. Other things that were just beginning to happen, we had just got our first radiocarbon dating chronology for Bronze Age metalwork in Britain, somewhat belatedly. The first proper scientific analyses of bronzes that were seeking to source the origins of the metal that the bronzes were made of had just started. The particular study looking at lead isotopes in bronze objects, which was undertaken by Brenda Roll and Stuart Needham, had just been published, attempting to source the origins of the metal, which obviously was taking advantage of the fact that we had our first indications of actual copper sources that were exploited in the Bronze Age in this country. Places like Paris Mountain and Ross Island in Ireland, Great Orme, Cymysfrith, Paris Mountain and others in Wales, or the Edge in England, so on. And then other things like the work that David Yates has done in attempting to sort of produce this overarching explanation for how metal was used and valued and circulated in connection with the appearance of field systems and enclosed settlements in the later Bronze Age in particular. And also work on investigating the actual find spots of bronze finds, including haunts. One of the problems that we had previously is that so many items, we had very little or no real understanding of their archaeological context. And obviously there's investigations into those which have been quite interesting. But having said that, I'm not really going to talk much about that at all. The cat has appeared. Excuse me, I'm just going to push him away. So when the original invitation to speak was made, which was, it seems, years ago now, was about 18 months ago, I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to talk about before circumstances intervened. I had one particular collection of metalwork from Somerset in mind and was going to arrange various museum and archive visits. Now, those still haven't happened, obviously. I'm hoping to do them, perhaps in the spring. So what I'm actually going to be offering here is a sort of work in progress, highlighting some of the methods and sources that I've used to date, some of the problems that have been encountered, some of the questions raised, some of the interesting snippets of information that have emerged, you know, from the safety and comfort of my own home, rather than from actually going out and looking at stuff. So I don't actually have any photos of any actual Bronze Age objects from Somerset to show you today. Obviously, I could have borrowed some from other publications or websites, but I decided to stick with showing you the illustrations that I myself have been able to see, rather than maybe give a false impression that I've actually been able to examine the objects. And also, I'm going to talk mainly about, you know, looking back rather than looking forward, if you like, about re-examining older finds rather than new ones, about exploring how ideas about the Bronze Age and its metalwork have changed or not over time. Obviously, it's new discoveries and new methods that tends to get attention these days, particularly in the media. This is something that we encounter regularly in my day job, which is in aerial archaeology, where you know, one of the particular issues that we have is that people seem to get very excited, not so much about what's on the aerial photographs, but on the method that they were taken. So people tend to be very disappointed when we say, you know, we don't tend to use drones or satellite imagery. You know, it's just somebody pointing a camera out the window of a Cessna. So, which is curious, you know, the idea that the thing that gets the camera off the ground is what's more important than what's on the photograph. I do wonder if people got that excited when the step ladder was invented. So that's a whinge for another day. Anyway, so what I'm interested in is, as I say, the things that have already been found, things that you can see in museums, whether in the display cabinets or in the storerooms. Do we really know everything that it's possible to know about them? I'm not just talking about what we might be able to learn about, say, the Bronze Age, what happened in the distant past from a fresh reappraisal of Bronze Age artifacts, but also what we can learn about the history of the objects themselves, and particularly things like the details surrounding provenance, you know, where were they found, the circumstances they were discovered, and so on. You know, how complete and reliable is the information that we might otherwise be tempted to take for granted? And obviously, this does have a connection with you know, the interpretations that we might then build onto what happened in the Bronze Age. You know, will new information about the circumstances of a particular hoard change our understanding of the Bronze Age as a result? And I particularly want to stress the importance of non-archaeological sources here. Not everything of relevance is going to be found in the pages of archaeological journals or the storerooms of museums. I'm talking specifically about historical research, which can be incredibly time-consuming. So today I'm only going to be focused, and I should say that it's something that it's a collection that I was already interested in. Somerset has some interesting and curious collections of metalwork. And one of the interesting things about some of these Somerset finds, particularly from the 19th century, is that there is actually an awful lot of information available about them, which is something I hadn't encountered in other parts of the country where I worked. You know, there's a tendency to have little or no information whatsoever about circumstances of discovery, but there are a number of interesting Somerset hoards where there is an awful lot of information, and a lot of it is still untapped in an archaeological sense. Because it's you know, I particularly wanted to highlight the fact that there are still things that can be uncovered about even some of the most familiar and apparently most studied objects. But also at the same time, I want to stress that some of the lesser known or seemingly less important objects can nonetheless produce fascinating stories and shed light on all manner of things. I think just about any object in a museum has an interesting story to tell. Just may take some time to get there. I mean, one of my own personal favourites, this isn't a Somerset find, this is from Wiltshire. This is a pull stave that was found in Blunsdon. This was actually brought to a finds identification day about 15 years ago. It's the only find all day that I knew anything about, funnily enough. But the lady who brought it said that it had been, as far as she was aware, it had been found about 1906 and had stayed in the finder's family ever since. But a fair amount of digging in the archives and looking around contemporary publications and correspondence between people meant that I was actually able not just to confirm the various stories that have been handed down within the family about the object itself, but also to add to it. And this also resulted in one of my favourite finds. Tucked in a notebook belonging to the archaeologist A.D. Passmore in Devizes Museum was an envelope containing, you can see top left there, a photograph of the same axe in an envelope dated 1919. Another example, a few years ago, I actually managed to publish a paper that was over 10,000 words long on an object that not only turned out to date to the 19th century AD rather than BC, but we couldn't even locate it in a museum store anymore. So there's endless possibilities of kind of research that you can do. Now that wasn't a Somerset find either, I should add. Before I get properly started, I should also point out one of the advantages of doing any work on Bronze Age metalwork in the southwest is that you, including Somerset, you actually have a reasonably up-to-date published corpus of Bronze Age finds from the county. Susan Pierce published a 2-volume book in the British Archaeological Reports series in 1983, the Bronze Age Metalwork of Southwestern Britain, and that was updated. An update was published in 2015 by Susan Pierce herself, Teresa Ormond, and Matthew Knight, which added, I forget the exact total of new finds for the southwest, but there are 211 new objects from 117 find spots from Somerset alone sit in there. But I should also mention as well that the existence of these corpuses, they don't provide all the answers. They're a start for further research, not an end point, not a baseline. So, for instance, there's lots of information about the circumstances of discovery of each of the new finds that's mentioned that isn't in there. You still need to do some work from there itself. Anyway, so Taunton. I'm actually specifically going to be talking about one find from within Taunton itself. I wasn't going to show any aerial photographs today, but I spotted this one the other day and I quite like it. This is a view of Taunton from, I think, the southeast, taken in 1953. So what I'm going to talk about with this particular collection of objects is just go back and look at the information that we have and the information that exists about the circumstances of discovery, about the contents of the hoard, about the way it was understood at the time, and something about its early publication record. Just to sort of give you an example of the kind of information that is lurking out there, awaiting people to sort of read it and build on it. But I wanted to just quickly point this out. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this. There are various versions of this illustration in existence. I chose this one purely because it's got a bit of colour in it, unlike most of my other slides today. But down the left-hand side, you'll see there's a column called Metalwork Assemblages. And what's happened over the years, decades, perhaps even longer, with the classification of Bronze Age metalwork through studies of typology and seriation, is that these sequential arrangement of metalworking assemblages has been created, with each one is characterized by a particular set of distinctive objects that belong to that period and sort of enable linkages to be made with other collections of material and so on. And each of these assemblages has been assigned the name of a particular find. And if you look about just below halfway, just at the bottom of that sort of little pink shaded area, you'll see the name Taunton. So the Taunton metalworking phase, which is early in the Middle Bronze Age, but not the earliest stage of the Middle Bronze Age, and through the radiocarbon dating of material associated with the bronzes that's been underway since the 1990s. This phase is assigned a sort of date range of circa 1400 BC to about 1270, 1280, plus or minus a few decades, obviously given the vagaries of radiocarbon dating. So this hoard from Taunton that I'm going to talk about has given its name to a phase of metalworking. One of the interesting things about the way these metalwork phases have, of course, developed is that the name Taunton now sort of floats somewhat freely almost disconnected from the find that gave the phase its name as more metalwork has been discovered and as interpretations have shifted and changed. So it's a label assigned to a period of the Bronze Age, in particular the metalworking, that is no longer firmly attached to the find that gave the period its name. I'll show you the find from the assembly for a while. But first of all, I wanted to talk quickly about the process of finding information about these sites. Obviously, I mean, this is something that people will be well aware of. There are online databases that give a certain basic level of basic information and sources about these objects. Two in particular, both of which are accessible through the website called the Heritage Gateway. First of all, there's our own Historic England research database. This is a screenshot of a search on Taunton that I did, and you can see down here towards the bottom. Hopefully you can see my cursor, where we have a reference to the Middle Bronze Age hoard found by workmen in February 1877 in the grounds of the workhouse. If we click on there, we've got the basic record, which gives a grid reference for the find spots, some basic information, and a list of sources. And obviously the same is true of the Somerset Historic Environment record, which again you can consult online. One thing I'm always keen to point out is that there is a tendency for people to look at one record or the other. Please don't assume that both have identical information about any particular site or find, let alone this one. Both the HER and the Historic England record do have the same origin point, which is source one here, which is the Ordnance Survey Archaeology Division card index. But after that start point, there is a tendency for records to diverge according to the sort of the priorities and working practices of whoever is responsible for compiling them. And one of the advantages of the HER record, the Historic England record, is that you actually have the museum accession numbers of the various finds. And obviously the HER, we have the online map which shows us where the find spot is on a modern map, pinpointed to here, based on the grid reference supplied by the Ordnance Survey. And then we've got websites like Know Your Place, which for the Southwest you can actually consult sequences of historic maps. But that find spot is over here. The hoard is it's often referred to as the Taunton Head, but its full name is the Taunton Union Workhouse Hoard. It's found in the grounds of the workhouse in 1877, which I'll get onto in a moment, and was apparently found during the digging of foundations for one of these outlying buildings. Only part of the workhouse survives today. If I just go back, see the cursor. So this block, the southern face of the workhouse buildings, still is the bit that still survives today, converted for domestic use. As far as the actual find spot goes, I can't be 100% sure, not having been able to visit, but I believe this is the surviving perimeter wall of the workhouse grounds. If that's correct, then the find spot is somewhere in the gap between the front of this car and the edge of this house on this side of the wall. So, you know, they do feel free to go and gorp at it if so wish. I always look at aerial photographs because that's my job. Sometimes they can help with an insight into the, sorry, it's a train going past, just like that finish. 1:30 on the hour they go, so we should be free for another half an hour or so. You can probably just make out the workhouse here, which has obviously since been demolished. And if we zoom in, sometimes the historic aerial photographs can give you a better idea of the topography of early finds or sites which are no longer extant, particularly in areas which have been built up since. Not quite the case here, but it's nice to see an aerial view of the structure. And that boundary wall is over here. So, you know, I do wonder if this is the building that was responsible for the discovery being made. Just a quick word about grid references. You'll find that, as I said, a lot of these historic finds, 19th century, early 20th century, have been assigned a grid reference. And if you go back to the maps, you may see the find spot actually marked on the Ordnance Survey map. This isn't the Taunton Union Workhouse Fort. This is one a little to the west, Sherford. I think this is on the edge of a golf course now. Obviously, the Ordnance Survey didn't put a grid on its maps until after the First World War. So when you're dealing with earlier finds, you do have to ask yourself where the grid reference came from. In a number of cases, it's simply a process of Ordnance Survey surveyors prior to 1920 and post 1920, the Ordnance Survey Archaeology Division just knocking on doors and asking people if they know where things are found, point out the site, point out the find spot, in addition to consulting museums and so on. Sometimes they're reliable, sometimes they're not. The Taunton Union Workhouse find spot isn't marked on the 6-inch or 25-inch maps, which is the most commonly digitized and the most commonly accessible map. So it's actually marked on a 1 to 500 scale map, which I'm not sure if there's an online version of it, but do be aware that there are other editions of Ordnance Survey maps that might provide useful information. Obviously, since discovery, the Taunton Union Workhouse hoard, in giving its name to the particular phase of metalwork, has obviously attracted a lot of attention. I'm not going to go through that whole process of the way it's being interpreted, analysed, classified, etc. It's a Saturday morning. Life's too short. I don't want to start losing members of the audience. It's not the most exciting stuff. But I just wanted to highlight a few useful sources of information that have emerged along the way. One in particular is what used to be called the National Bronze Implements Index, which I'm not sure if people are aware of. This is a card index whose origins date to 1913, initially under the aegis of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and then subsequently the British Museum. And most recently, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, most of the cards were scanned and the information transcribed through a project undertaken by Microplasts, the organisation. I've not been able to find a searchable version of the card index online, but there is this web address at the bottom. There are on Flickr, there are various albums of photographs covering this, containing all the scanned images, and these are 2 of the Taunton Union Workhouse axes. These contains the basic information, which I'm not sure if you'll be able to read, but the location of the find spot, a brief account of the circumstances of discovery, some of the sources, measured drawings of the objects, as well as measurements of particular parts of the objects according to those which are considered useful for classification purposes. This was part of a systematic attempt to document all known Bronze Age metalwork finds from the British Isles, and was initially the brainchild of the archaeologists Harold Peake and O.G.S. Crawford, who had the idea in 1913 and started recording objects initially themselves, and then getting others involved subsequently. And after the First World War, this letter was one of a number that was sent out to museum curators all over the country, explaining the scheme to them and what they were expecting, and what they were hoping that the people would do. So just a little close-up of the initial explanation about what they were up to. So they're talking about having 1,000 cards already completed by 1919. Obviously a drop in the ocean compared to the number of finds that were known. One of the things about the card index worth stressing is that people like Peake, and particularly Crawford, once he was based at the Ordnance Survey from 1920, they were tapping into networks of acquaintances, archaeologists, antiquarians, etc., which meant that they were able to capture, as in this instance, objects that were in private collections. So this is I mean, whether you want to call it a fan sex or a pull stave is entirely up to you. This is from Wellington in Somerset, and this is in the private collection of somebody known to both Crawford and Peake. So there are objects from Somerset in there that aren't or weren't in museums. Obviously, the card index with that sort of pro forma approach implies a sort of systematic approach to capturing information about objects, but it's important not to mistake a systematic recording process for an objective one, especially when, as in this case, the categories of information required by the form seem to have a sort of common sense feel about them. I mean, this card index was established for very particular reasons. Peake, Crawford and Co. had particular questions about prehistory that they wanted to address, and they saw this card index as a key to their work. And a clue to what they were up to is offered by one of the names of the committee that we're overseeing, as you can see here, the distribution of Bronze Age implements. So they were after information that wouldn't just tell them where objects were found, but would help them to understand the distribution. And this is about a particular approach to the geography of archaeological phenomena, drawing on approaches that were developing in human and physical geography and historical geography in the late 19th, early 20th century. The idea that plotting the distributions of particular classes of object would offer insight into the distribution of settlement and also the routes along which objects and therefore people might have travelled, whether engaged in trade, warfare, or whatever. So the information that they wanted to capture, both in terms of written information and the things that they wanted to be highlighted on the drawings, were designed to examine these questions. And obviously that's something that got lost as the card index continued to develop, particularly once it was shifted to the British Museum. And it's also important to remember in connection with this that this wasn't the only card index that was established around the same time by the same people to examine these questions. There was also a card index of megalithic sites, which had more of a European than a strictly British focus, because Peake, Crawford and others at the time believed the spread of megalithic architecture and the spread of early metalworking were closely allied processes, and they hoped that the two indexes and the information captured within complement each other. So these card indexes aren't straightforward. As I said, these origins aren't necessarily evident when examining the cards today. There's also not just official records of what this committee was up to, but there is some unofficial information, a certain amount of informal documentation about what was going on in the personal archives and correspondence of those involved. So, for instance, the Crawford archive at the Bodleian Library has letters from Harold Peake in the early years, and we can follow their exploits in trying to capture the information about bronzes in various museums around the country, including Somerset. So here in 1917, while Crawford was on leave from the front, we have this letter from Peake where he's asking Crawford to pop in and see Harold St George Gray, curator of Taunton Museum at the time, saying, "I wrote to him once on the subject but got no reply. I wish he would undertake all the Somerset examples." And then a couple of years later, after the war, Crawford, by now undertaking his own research, and we can see temporarily based at the Hare and Hounds Hotel in Shepton Mallet. This letter is part of one where Crawford and Peake are trying to identify a draftsman who they can employ to do the drawings for them. They've identified this A.T. Wicks, and again, hoping that Taunton, Bath and Glastonbury and any other museums there may be in Somerset can be dealt with. This question, by the by, was there anything of importance in Shepton Mallet Museum? You know, feel free to put anything in the chat if you're aware. And again, a year later, interesting archival point here. This letter was actually posted in January 1920, but Peake has written 1919. I'm pretty sure we've all made that mistake at some point over the new year. But here he's obtained money to employ a draftsman to print up more cards. And again, he's still hoping that Taunton might be done. Obviously, it could happen eventually. Another source which sort of developed out of this, but this is specifically British Museum related, is this publication, Inventaria Archaeologica, which was a sort of European-wide initiative where key finds from the Bronze Age were published in some detail in a card format, which allowed easier comparison between different objects. This particular set, 7th set GB 42 to 47, has an almost entirely Somerset focus, again, including the Taunton Union Workout sword. And here's just an example of the cards. This is showing the Taunton find objects. So on one side of the card, you have drawings, measure drawings of the objects themselves. And on the other side, you have information about them, a list of sources, a brief account of the circumstances of discovery, and then a sort of brief description, as well as a list of comparisons from other finds. And there, so I'll go back and just quickly highlight. So what you have in hoards like this Taunton hoard, and why it's sort of regarded as so typical of the period that it represents, is this mixture of tools, particularly axes, and ornaments and other items. So we have these large pin type things here, fragments. We have a spearhead. We have a razor. We have an early socketed axe. We have a socketed hammer. We have a torque. We have a bracelet. Both of them with similar twisting metal style. We have various rings and things, and of course the ball staves themselves, a number of different forms, and 2 sickles, and again information and also an attempt at dating. But obviously at this stage, the sword is being dated to sort of 1200 to 1000 BC. Obviously that's shifted back in time as things have developed. So having just gone through some of the basic sources, I want to now jump back to the late 1870s, the discovery of the hoard and what happened in its immediate wake. Explain why I find it of particular interest as well. And this requires introducing a gentleman called Dr. James Hurley Pring, who was a member of various committees attached to the Somerset Society from, I think, the 1850s onwards to his death in 1889. I haven't been able to pin down a picture of him yet. He was born in 1815, educated at Taunton Grammar School, took his MD at Edinburgh University, had stints in Paris, Vienna, Switzerland, etc., before settling in Bath, where he took over the practice of his uncle, Dr. Daniel Pring, then moved to Weston-super-Mare in 1845, and then to Taunton again in the early 1860s, when he effectively retired from medical practice and became much more heavily involved in antiquarian pursuits, and antiquarian rather than archaeological, which gives an idea of his approaches. And he actually published a book focusing on the hoard and ideas of his arising from it in terms of the status of Taunton in British prehistoric and Roman times. Now, this is a photo of my own copy of the book. I actually have 2 copies of this book. Antiquarian books of this kind can be very expensive, obviously, not in this case. This is quite cheap, and there are copies floating around. This one also has quite an interesting history. It's, as you can see, it came from the University of Reading Library, who offloaded it a few years ago. Obviously, libraries offload books for all manner of reasons, and I don't know the precise circumstances here. I presume it's because the book, its contents are effectively outdated in terms of understanding what happened in the Bronze Age. Obviously, in terms of what was happening in 19th century archaeology, it remains of importance. So, but it's the primary publication of one of the key Bronze Age hoards from southern Britain, and an invaluable insight in the kinds of arguments underway in the 19th century about the significance of this material. But as I say, the book itself has this interesting history, which I'll just go into briefly if I can get the cursor to reappear. We have this bookplate from University Library Reading. It says presented by W.H.B. Joseph Bequest. Joseph himself was a tutor in philosophy at Oxford University, what he's best known for, and he died in 1943, which is presumably when the W.H.B. Joseph Bequest made its way to Reading University. Unfortunately, the date is obscured by this sort of ticket holder. I forget what these are called. And obviously there's the more recent barcode, etc. But you see the stamps were drawn from the university library. There's a piece of paper here which has been pasted in, which I'll mention in a moment. But if we lift that up, you can see the original dedication. The Reverend C.W. Bowes, or Bowes, I don't know how to pronounce it, with the author's compliments, dated 1882. This particular Reverend was a lecturer in modern history, among other things, at Oxford University as well. Died in 1895, which, as the next signature shows, is when Sir Joseph acquired the book. So in other words, we've pretty much got the complete history of the book laid out on those 2 pages. You know, it's gone from Pring, the author, to Bowes or Bowes in 1882, then to Joseph in 1895, to the University of Reading Library in 1943, where it spent the best part of 70 years on the shelves before the university decided to offload it, and then obviously came into my possession once I realised how expensive it was. Now, bearing in mind that history, I just should mention that piece of paper that's folded over, Pring has actually printed up a sheet with the highlights of press reviews of the book. Just point out that despite that history of use and ownership, most of the pages in the book are still uncut. So 70 years in the university library, this book has almost certainly never been read. This is also the reason why I ended up buying a second copy, a much cheaper one, because of its poor condition, so that I could actually read it. I didn't want to cut the pages open of that book unless I had to. This one too has an interesting history. It's been in the Ashmolean Library. It came from the personal library of Francis Haverfield, who was Professor of Ancient History at Oxford, a key figure in the development of Romano-British archaeological history. And also has another Pring's publications, a pamphlet on Roman coins pasted in the back of it. And again, with the dedication to the Reverend C.W. Bowes. So these books also contain lots of information about the sort of the networks that people belong to, about the kind of people that were interested in the subject matter as well. Anyway, these are the illustrations of the objects that feature in Pring's book. I don't know how other people feel, but I much prefer these antiquarian style illustrations of bronzes from an aesthetic point of view to the sort of the modern type of drawings. But, you know, that's beside the point, obviously. Anyway, how did the book come about? Why is there a book dedicated to a single Bronze Age hoard from Somerset? I mean, a book on a Bronze Age hoard published in the late 19th century is a rarity in any case. But essentially, we owe the existence of the book and this detailed discussion of the objects and their significance to the poor reception that Pring received to a talk he gave on the objects to a meeting of the Royal Archaeological Institutes of Great Britain and Ireland. That meeting took place in August 1879. These, at the time, and still to a certain extent, these national societies would have an annual meeting where they would go somewhere provincial to gather for a couple of weeks of talks and site visits and field trips, etc., etc. And in 1879, the Somerset Society had actually invited the Royal Archaeological Institute to come and base its meeting at Taunton. The society was keen to show off the recently repaired and restored castle and the museum, as well as the archaeological and architectural highlights of Taunton and the surrounding area. So large numbers of antiquarians and archaeologists descended on Taunton from all over the country to see the sites and hear contributions from well-known members of the Institute itself, as well as from local antiquarians and archaeologists and architectural historians. And there's an awful lot of detail about the meeting and its proceedings in the local, regional, as well as the national press, including near verbatim reports on some of the speeches, including an utterly bizarre one from Bishop of Bath and Wells, which I do recommend people seek out. Anyway, Pring gave his talk on the evening of Tuesday, the 5th of August, one of two that evening. The other was by Sir Charles Anderson on an architectural theme, specifically towers, and was much better received than Pring's talk. So several newspapers reporting on the evening either simply mentioned that Pring spoke and offered no other. They don't mention him at all. Somewhat lengthy. Obviously, we can read many things into that statement. Whereas other accounts give the impression of a pretty lively and none too positive response from the audience. One audience member was quoted as referring to Pring's paper as containing, and I quote, the most undiluted nonsense he had ever heard. There was also apparently lots of laughter before the chairman intervened, thanking Pring for his contribution and asking that further discussion should be carried on only with care. He also fared none too well in the press, or at least in the publications that mentioned him. So the Athenaeum, the publication rather than the club itself, stated that Dr. Pring was not fortunate in his speculations or the authorities on which he leaned, with some of his arguments resting on no foundation beyond fancy. And their review of the following paper by Sir Charles Anderson also carried implicit criticism of Pring. Anderson's paper, they said, was short, and added that as he spoke of what he saw and what he knew only, it was interesting, as well as being an important contribution to our knowledge. And the Saturday Review weighed in. It didn't mention Pring by name, but it did refer to the undoubting acceptance of the old exploded tales of the Druids and other historical myths, and the boldness with which local names were tortured into evidence of the author's position was highlighted, as well as the audience response, the comment about undiluted nonsense, and the intervention by the chairman, with the account finishing that the discussion was one of the most animated and amusing, and we may add, not the least useful, of the Congress. So it's that response to Pring's paper, particularly the press coverage, that led to his decision to publish a book, the book being partly a response to that criticism itself. And was also partly inspired by the fact that the Royal Archaeological Institute only chose to publish a short extract of his paper in the journal rather than, as had previously been promised, the paper in full. In fact, the introduction to Pring's book actually comprises a 19-page long reply to his critics before he gets on to discussing the bronzes themselves. And in all the copies that I've seen of that book, that summary of the opinions of the press, all positive, has been pasted in different places. So presumably Pring's doing that as he circulates copies. Pring insisted that the version of his paper contained in the book was essentially unchanged from the version that he read before the Taunton meeting, but this is clearly not true. He's done an awful lot more research, particularly into the background of the bronzes themselves. He's contacted a lot of authorities, including people like Sir John Evans. It's the section on the wider implications of the Hoard, where he particularly dwelled on place name evidence, which he seems to have largely stuck to his guns, and which is very much in keeping with the times. So what he was keen to use the Hoard as a basis for was the idea that Taunton was a British, i.e. pre-Roman foundation, in opposition to the idea that the town was a Saxon foundation. So he goes into great detail about this, drawing on other prehistoric finds and the Roman coins to make his case. I mean, it's obviously it seems very outdated. Now, one of the interesting things people arguing against him are also using arguments that are outdated now. So it can at times feel as though, you know, on the one hand you've got Pring insisting that 2 and 2 is 3, and people in opposition insisting that no, it's not, it's 5. But obviously these debates need to be considered in conjunction with the times. But one of the interesting things is that Pring never refers to the Bronze Age, even when citing the authority of people like Sir John Evans or referring to John Lovett's book Prehistoric Times. He doesn't seem to have accepted the idea of the 3-age system. We still have that sort of antiquarian succession of Britons to Romans to Saxons, with a reliance on written authority, whether fellow antiquarians, historians, or the classical sources that they drew on. So Pring is discussing the objects as though they belong to that immediately pre-Roman cultural context that he was aware of from the likes of Caesar and so on, which is where sort of slightly problematic hints of Druidic associations come in. So, for instance, one section that he did actually end up cutting out of the book version of his talk was which had been in the paper that he read to the Royal Archaeological Institute, is the suggestion that the two sickle blades in the hoard could be identified with the sickles purportedly used by Druids to cut mistletoe, and which had attracted considerable ridicule on the evening of the talk. One of the interesting things is Pring's discussion about why so many collections of objects were being deposited in the ground in the Bronze Age, because this seems both outdated and antiquarian, but also contains considerable echoes of explanations which we're still current, I was going to say saddled with. So he talks about the suggestion that hoards were being deposited for religious or votive reasons, that some religious or votive intent lay behind it, which sometimes even today you see being presented as a sort of fairly recent idea, with discoveries in the 80s at places like Flag Fen being behind it. But in fact, the idea of a votive intent behind deposition is something that goes back to, William Stukely in the early 18th century was talking about it as a possible explanation. Pring's suggestion in terms of the specific religious intent is tied with his idea that these objects were part of the equipment of Druids, and that burial was something to do with a concealment or disposal at the time of the Roman invasion. Pring's other alternative, which he's less keen on, is what he describes as the more modern view. And again, these are explanations that are still with us. The idea that these were the property of wandering bronzesmiths who buried or concealed their stock in trade, or that they were objects that had been gathered together ready to be put into the melting pot. Or that they were objects that belonged to particular individuals' personal possessions. So essentially, he's outlining the kind of categories of hoard that you will still see discussed in literature today. These go back a long time and have slightly problematic origins, which I think we should be attempting to unpick a bit more than we're actually doing. Now, Pring wasn't the first person to study these hoards, although he gave his paper in 1879, just 2 years or so after they were discovered. There is actually a fair amount of information about them existing prior to the publication of his book, and this is where we get onto non-archaeological sources, in particular, in this case, newspapers. The earliest reference to the hoard I can find was published on Wednesday, the 14th of February, 1877 in the Taunton Courier. This is just 4 days after the objects were discovered. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to read this. It's just for illustration, but you can see discovery of British remains. And there's some basic information about the circumstances of discovery. While digging the foundations of some labour sheds, the workmen came upon a quantity of bronze implements, heavy red clay about 3 feet from the surface. There's a sort of list of the kinds of objects that are present. And there's also some speculation about their age, so about 2,000 years. So pretty much in keeping with sort of Pring's approach, that these are sort of immediately pre-Roman. But there are a few pieces of interest. First of all, the reference which occurs in other newspaper accounts published over the next couple of weeks in different newspapers, at least 50 distinct pieces of metal. I haven't seen the objects myself. I've only seen the drawings in the various sources that I've shown you. But even taking into account that some of the objects were broken on discovery, I cannot make the total up to 50. So there is the possibility that the hoard, as constituted in Taunton Museum, does not contain all the objects that were found on the 10th of February, 1877. And in this conjunction with this, it's interesting to point out that the standard inventory of objects that was appearing in the press refers to 3 spearheads. Now, there's one definite spearhead in the hoard, and there's one item which is actually a razor, but which for some time was misunderstood and misinterpreted as being a spearhead. But there is not a third object that I can see that is mistaken for a spearhead. So perhaps one of the objects that we're potentially missing is a Bronze Age spearhead. Again, further research necessary in the newspapers, in our contemporary archives and correspondence. And also this statement at the end where it says at the meeting of the Guardians on Thursday, which would have been the 15th of February, it will be considered whether further excavations should be made. Now, did that excavation happen? This is an extract from the Somerset County Gazette published Saturday, February the 17th. Obviously, publishing weekly on the Saturday meant that they'd missed out on the scoop, but caught up with this sort of what is actually a fairly lengthy account, but which has some interesting additions. So by now, the Guardians have had their meeting, where they resolved to present the collection to the Somerset Archaeological Society and to give permission to the curator of the Society's museum to make further excavations in the locality where the articles were found, should such a step be deemed necessary. Now, I've not found so far any information to confirm whether any further excavation happened, if so, whether it was done under the auspices of the Society and or its museum curator. So again, further work needs to be undertaken here on the archives. But also this final section, the master of the workhouse informed us on Friday that some human remains have been found near where the bronze articles were dug up. Again, I found no subsequent reference to bronze to human remains being found in connection with the bronzes or in close proximity to the bronzes. And obviously, if we're dealing with the grounds of a workhouse that's been in existence for over 40 years, there are potentially other explanations for why there are human remains. But again, further work needs to be done. And obviously, some of that further work needs to be done in relation to examining the archives of the workhouse itself rather than archaeological sources. I've begun that process looking at stuff that's available online, of which there is quite a lot. Obviously, workhouses are something that's been of historical interest to people for some time. So there's a lot of information generally about them, not necessarily specifically about Taunton. One interesting source is this report into an outbreak of cholera at the workhouse in 1849, which makes horrendous reading. It's available online freely through the Wellcome Collections online library. But a number of points in here that recur in other sources that refer to the workhouse, in particular, the poor quality of construction, the defective structural arrangements, its wretched construction, low, badly constructed sheds, etc., etc. And this recurs through subsequent reports. So one of the interesting things here is obviously that we don't owe the discovery of the hoard to the existence of the workhouse specifically, but to the fact that the workhouse was so badly constructed that it was necessary to build additional buildings within the grounds. The other thing that's worth pointing out, again, recurs is problems with the drainage in the area. Its situation, though suburban, is badly drained in its reference to a nearby pestilential ditch. Drainage issues is something, as I said, that recurs, and it's interesting to consider this in conjunction with the investigation of hoard find spots that's been going on over the last 15, 20 years, particularly the work of people like Richard Bradley and David Yates in Sussex and Surrey. But the tendency for hoards to have been buried close to or in proximity to damp or slogged ground or seasonal watercourses. So is that a situation that we have here as well? So bearing in mind the time, I shall draw to a close there and allow people to sort of answer questions or to just run away screaming. But as I say, this is a statement of, as I said, work in progress on the Taunton Workhouse hoard and on several other hoards from Somerset, which throw up a number of interesting questions, both about the objects and the circumstances themselves, and also about things like those relationships between national and local archaeological societies, that sort of process of moving on from sort of antiquarianism to a sort of archaeological approach to the past, and so on. So if anyone wants to contact me or ask questions or even provide information with confidence, do feel free. But as I say, I will be continuing with this work. So I shall stop there.
Thank you very much, Martyn.
It's good to hear another voice and realise that there was somebody listening.
Thank you very much indeed. A fascinating tale about what just simply one hoard from the county. I'm quite amazed that you've managed to find out so much about it. But it does say a lot about the way in which this kind of find has been treated over the years, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency to assume, I think, and particularly with the better known stuff, that everything there is to be discovered has been discovered. But at the same time, there's always been this very narrow focus on specifically archaeological sources of information. So the proceedings of county journals and so on, whereas a lot of the interesting information is going to be in local newspapers, in other archives, in this case, the workhouse and related collections.
It encouraged me to try and seek out Pring's book, actually, see what he has said.
I did check the other day. There are actually several copies online. When I bought my that original copy several years ago, there were a number to choose from. Obviously, I opted for that one because the bookseller in that case had provided this long description of all the additional things that were in it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we have a copy in the Society's library. We have a number of questions that are popping up. Just a reminder to everyone, if you've got a question to ask, if you go into the Q&A you will see, you'll be able to type your question in there. We have one from Roger, who asks, I would like to know if anyone has any idea how Stone Age persons first discovered the technology to produce bronze. Martyn.
Oh dear, how have we got? Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's the whole problem of identifying when and where the technology arises. I mean, particularly with bronze. I mean, one of the interesting things about the British Isles is that although manufacturing items in copper is something that has a very, very long history going back to what, 5th, 6th millennium BC, way over to the east, Asia Minor, Far Eastern Europe, etc. The intentional alloying of copper with tin is something that we don't really encounter till the late 3rd millennium BC in any quantity. And the British Isles is one of the first places where that happens. But again, one of the problems is that we don't have, although we're beginning to identify copper sources, identifying sources of tin that were exploited at the time is far more problematic. There is a project underway at the moment to try and do that. And also metalworking sites themselves, the places where metal was prepared and cast are, ridiculously scarce, very, very difficult to identify. I mean, the remains are going to be extremely ephemeral at those early stages anyway. So we don't have the sites that have been identified yet to be able to properly understand the processes and therefore work out, how the process may have arisen, where it originated, how the idea happened.
So there is a lot of fieldwork still to be done on identifying how sources of tin, particularly.
Yeah, as I said, there is a project whose name I forget at the moment. They do have a website looking into the origins of tin extraction and exploitation. It's probably called something like the Ancient Tin Project or something. It's a big academic project with a sort of a network of European and I think Asian-based scholars looking at the whole question.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We have a second question from actually our chair, David Baker, about the purpose of socketed axes. We hear that they're not very practical implements. Is there any current thought about what it is they're used for?
Oh, they are very practical. implement. There's been a number of experiments, sort of experimental casting to produce objects and then, just use them to hit things with. And the earliest axes, the early flat axes, which are made entirely of copper, don't offer any advantage whatsoever over stone, flint or stone axes for things like woodworking and so on. The copper is quite soft relative to the stone. But once you start getting that admixture of tin, and particularly later on with the addition of lead and also the sort of improvements in casting technology and hammering, they do become very efficient, very sharp, very effective instruments, not just for woodworking, but for anything you might want to hit hard with a blade. But we do have this issue in later hoards, particularly towards the end of the Bronze Age, where we have a number of very poor quality castings being deposited in the ground. And it's also an issue throughout the Bronze Age that you do find objects being hoarded in ineffectively and as cast condition, objects which have been cast, maybe tidied up a little, but then never used. So I think the question over the efficiency of the axes sort of raises from there. But yes, it's an interesting phenomenon, particularly the late Bronze Age, the poor quality axes that almost seem like they're being cast with the intention of just putting them straight in the ground rather than used. But no, the socketed axes, particularly from the the main periods of the late Bronze Age, so post-Taunton phase, are very effective woodworking and general hitting things with objects.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a kind of perception that the addition of lead to the alloy actually would have a deleterious effect on the effectiveness of the metal by inducing additional softness to it. But it sounds from what you're saying that that's not the case.
The thing with lead is it's a question of how much you put in. It can have the effect of softening the metal, but it can reduce the casting temperature needed to cast the alloy itself. So it can actually make the manufacture of the axe more efficient and smooth the process. So there's a sort of slight payoff there. The more lead you add, the softer the resulting product is going to be. But if you can sort of control it carefully or reasonably carefully, then you can. And of course, also there's lots and lots of recycling going on, particularly by the later stages of the Bronze Age. So, if you've got an axe where the balance is right, or objects where the balance is about right, then as long as you don't add any more lead to it, the resulting newly cast object is going to be a fairly efficient piece of equipment as well.
So does that give credence to the idea that at least some of these hoards are cycling?
Yeah, there's still the problem about why they're being put in the ground in the first place. And also that there's interesting patterns that have been observed in terms of their content. So some types of objects aren't being put in the ground. We have molds for objects that aren't known from hoards. And also where you've got broken objects, it's particular parts of particular types of objects are more common in hoards than others. So that there are selection processes going on in terms of the way objects are broken up and in terms of what is going into the ground or what isn't going into the ground. So it's not just a straightforward random collection of stuff that's being recycled. There are still some issues to address there.
Thank you. We have a question from Martin Salzer. How far short of the 50 objects mentioned is there in the current hoard?
I should have foreseen this question, shouldn't I? I think the number of objects is in the, hang on, I've actually got within reach my copy of the Inventory Archaeological card. I look at Taunton Workhouse Hoard Card 2. So that lists 34 objects. Now, some of them are clearly broken, fragmented, but if you count a broken axe as 2, say, or a broken pin as 2, I get to a total of about 46, 47.
Right.
Obviously, if I can actually look at the objects themselves, I might be able to notice, you know, breakages that aren't apparent from the drawings. But even so, that constant reference to at least 50 or more than 50 in the newspapers suggests that there are a few objects that might have gone astray. And again, it's going to be a case of just looking through contemporary accounts, possibly that, you know, the museum archives, etc., to see if we can pin down whether this is correct or whether it's that initial newspaper count just got it.
Yeah.
Because obviously, we can't rely on newspapers to be completely accurate, can we?
Yeah. Amal's just posted that she's got 29 objects on the museum database. So there seems to be quite a gap somewhere. I suppose it's not to be unexpected over the course of time.
No, I mean, this is something I found when I did a lot of research in museums in Kent. And the number of objects that emerged simply from going through museum stores was quite impressive, because obviously you're dealing with stuff that may not have had any attention paid to it by researchers for some time. And maybe, you know, I've encountered stuff that's been sort of misattributed to different periods or misidentified as something else or from another hoard. And, you know, until another researcher comes along and examines the stuff closely, that situation is not going to change.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. The hoard seems to be objects for hitting oblique defence and pins oblique jewellery.
Yeah, one of the characteristic things about the Taunton phase, and one of the reasons why the Taunton Union Work household was regarded as characteristic, is because that period, particularly in the south and southwest, is characterised by hoards that mix axes with ornaments. In fact, the term ornament horizon has been applied to this phase for southern Britain, with the sort of analogous developments on the French coast, the other side of the channel, where around the same time you do start seeing more ornaments alongside axes in hoards. So this combination of pull staves, things for cutting things with, and what might be deemed personal ornament is a sort of characteristic feature of the period, with the occasional inclusion of something else, you know, like a razor, sickles, and spearhead, but in far fewer numbers. But generally, throughout the Bronze Age, it's axes that tend to dominate in hoards.
Thank you. Another question, any cooking vessels found?
Cooking vessels, as in metal ones?
I presume they mean metal, or it could be, I suppose, ceramic.
Yeah, I mean, nothing from the Middle Bronze Age, you know, coinciding with the Taunton phase, etc. The so-called cauldrons, the vast metal containers made of bronze, are sort of later developments. Although there are a few near complete examples, they too tend to turn up as small fragments in hoards, you know, chunks that have been cut out of them, etc. But you know, not contemporary with the Taunton phase. If you're looking for cooking vessels at that period, then you're dealing with those enormous and none too aesthetically pleasing pottery vessels. You know, the sort of Deverell Rimbury style urns, which can be fairly grotty to look at, but are very substantial and must have been a nightmare to make.
Well, as a ceramist, I would suggest they probably weren't a nightmare to make, but they're probably a nightmare to use.
Well, I don't know about Somerset, but particularly those from the southeast, where you get sort of a very strong admixture of chips of flint, which can be quite sizable and very sharp. It's just the idea of working something like that by hand.
Yeah. We have a question from Jack Rowe. Thinking of the preservation bias, are there any cases of items of more perishable materials being included in hoards that perhaps need more attention?
Perishable items. I mean, from the early accounts, you sort of sometimes get these hints that there was perishable material in there. Also, something I didn't mention in the case of the Taunton Hall, was a reference to discoloration of the soil that the objects were found in. Obviously, we don't know precisely what that may have been. There are things like with socketed implements, particularly from the later Bronze Age, the presence of fragments of wooden hearths still surviving, and obviously in wetland sites, you know, complete hearths as well. So while it's clear that most objects were deposited unhalved, there are occasions where part or the half is present, and obviously that's one of the key sources for radiocarbon dating, because you know you need your date to be something that's associated with the object, and you can't get a closer association than the actual half. Although there are problems here. I've come across, because most of my research previously has been on metalwork in Kent, and I know of 2 examples of typologically Taunton phase material where dating of associated half material has produced a date 3 or 4 centuries later. So there's some of these finds are sort of circulating for a long time. But otherwise, I can't think off the top of my head of examples where there is surviving non-organic material other than half material, or perhaps some kind of wrapping material, linen, grass, whatever, associated with it.
Right. Thank you. Henrietta has made a point. Pottery contemporary with the Taunton hoard is decorated Treviska related.
Ah, yes. Yeah, this is again. This is me being more used to working in the southeast, where we have 1 or 2 stray bits of Treviska ware, but it's mostly not Treviska over there. But yes, indeed.
Right.
I should mention, obviously, that there are occasions where hoards have actually been deposited inside a pottery vessel.
Thank you. Has anybody any more questions, please? There are none showing at the moment. If you have, please use the button. Okay. Well, I've had several comments back from the questioners saying thank you very much indeed for your answers. And I think that really concludes matters now. Before I hand back to David, may I thank you, Martyn, very much on behalf of all our listeners, viewers, whatever appropriate term is, for a fascinating talk. It's very interesting to see how far just concentrating on one particular find can actually take you in an exploration of archaeological perceptions.
Indeed, I mean, as I like to say, you know, there are interesting stories to be found about all manner of objects, even the most unprepossessing. But you know, obviously, so much depends on what information survives in archives. But you know, even if there's no information about the specific object itself, you can be led in all sorts of interesting directions once you start looking into the people involved at the time, say, and thinking in terms of things. You know, the object I mentioned that I'd written over 10,000 words on when we couldn't even find it was one of these bizarre objects in a museum. It's inscribed Egyptian limestone scarab. And the question there was, it's quite obviously modern. What on earth is it doing in the museum? And that just led into this sort of bizarre interlude, looking into ideas about whether there was Egyptian influence in the construction of Stonehenge. And that was the reason why the objects had been retained by the museum in the first place.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right, the cat has appeared. I'm just holding him off here.
Right. Well, it's obvious in the messages that we're receiving that there is a lot of virtual applause for your address. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Thank you
for everything. And could I hand back now to David Baker?
Yes. Well, I'd like to add my thanks to David's. I'm very interested in how old books and early Ordnance Survey large-scale maps and all that kind of thing. So that I really enjoyed that. that talk. Thank you, Martyn. Now, to everybody, I'd like to say, I'm sure you can find details on how to join SANHS, Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society. They're probably attached to this webinar, but if not, they're all online. So if you're not a member already, I would earnestly encourage you to join. And the second thing is, please don't forget Bronze Age Day Part 2, because that will be on the 20th of November this year. And we already have 3 speakers, Henrietta Quinnell, Andy Jones and Tom Cadbury. And added to that, we're hoping that we will be able to see Jodie Lewis. Now, because there'll be 4 speakers, we hope to start at 10 a.m. instead of 11. So that will be on the 20th of November. So having said that, I will declare the meeting closed and thank you all for your attendance. Okay, bye. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye, Martyn. Yes. And I think what we have to do is find the switch off button, which I never can. Yes.